to our public forum tonight. I'm Bob Russell, the founder and director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, and the Ian B. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the GT. Welcome to all of you for coming. So glad you're here. Just a word about tonight's event in relation to the big picture. One of our endowed programs we first created in my dad's honor, and now it's called the Russell Family Fellowship to honor my mom and Charlotte. The mission of the center is carried out by this fellowship in a really wonderful way. Our mission, as you know, is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science, and that involves programs in research, teaching, and public service. So tonight is public service, public forum, and it's given by this year's Russell Family Fellowship Fellows. Saturday we'll have a research conference, and I hope you'll be thinking about coming to that too. And both of those have great influence on our teaching program, and several of my wonderful doctoral students and entry doctoral students are here tonight from the class to be part of it. Let me read to you Joshua's biography because it's so impressive. Joshua Moritz, who is this year's Russell Family Fellowship holder, teaches undergraduate students in the philosophy department at the University of San Francisco. He has taught graduate students in theology and science at our Jesuit school right here and at Santa Clara, and at the School of Applied Theology in Berkeley. He is the director of the Christian Formation at Berkeley Covenant Church, where he teaches both adult and youth courses and works closely with youth ministry. Joshua is managing editor of our refereed scholarly journal, Theology and Science. So it's thanks to him that we have a journal and stay online and keep it running. He has written numerous books and articles, including Science and Religion, Beyond Warfare, and Tourism Setting, which is one of the best textbooks in the field. And Tourism Setting, the role of theology in the history and philosophy of science. And he's partnered with the American Association for the Advancement of Science to promote videos teaching science in seminary. Let me make a personal comment. Joshua came here in 2001. A dramatic day for all of us. Began taking courses from Kent Peterson, did his master's degree and PhD with us. And I really must say, it is one of the most spectacular stations I've ever seen. Josh was an absolute knockdown, brilliant man who has just an encyclopedic mind and memory. I think you remember everything you've ever written and more. So it's really a privilege to both have been a mentor for him, now to be a colleague and friend. And I'm so grateful for him for the work he does for our journal and for the center and the inspiration he shows me in saying, this is what my career is about, is having students become colleagues, teach in the field, and bring this deep understanding of the positive relation between faith and science, faith and reason, into the wider academic and then general public. So thank you, Joshua. Without further ado, Joshua Moritz.
Thank you so much, Bob, for your gracious words. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to have you as part of this conversation. And tonight I'm talking about the question of science and youth ministry. If you know Tertullian, then you might recognize a version of his question. What has science to do with youth ministry? He asked, what does Athens do with Jerusalem? What has the church to do with the academy? His rhetorical response to that is nothing. Nothing. So, and we'll talk about this question. Does science have anything to do with youth ministry? Is this a strange combination? What's the point of even talking about this? Why is it important? What does it have to do with religion today, with the church in general? And is this something worth thinking about in any sort of constructive manner? The questions we'll talk about tonight have to do with how important is it to engage science in youth ministry. Why am I talking about youth ministry is another question we'll talk about. What are the key questions and issues for youth today? Who has cultural authority? And why does that matter when you're talking about ministry or youth ministry in particular? What's the cost of ignoring science in youth ministry? And what are some practical steps to humbly, honestly, responsibly, and I would say prophetically, engage science in youth ministry? And so when you think about these questions, when I think about these questions, I'm thinking from my context as an educator. I've been almost 10 years at the University of San Francisco in the philosophy department, where I work with former youth. Lots of these freshmen, sophomores, and the rest were once in youth groups, in churches, in ministry, attended churches, and then I find out they're agnostics, they're atheists, they no longer believe this stuff, and I start asking questions. Well, why? And one of the classes I teach is philosophy of religion. I teach great philosophical questions, and so, going into this, I have a data set of well over 1,000 responses to different questions I asked them over almost 10 years. And looking at that data set, I see some trends. But then a few years ago, I started working with youth at Berkeley Covenant Church as well, and worked in a more unofficial capacity. But as director of formation, part of my job is working with youth, teaching youth classes, and finding these themes. Well, how not to make these mistakes when youth go away to college? How will we help them to keep their faith? Because in this context, and I assume for many of you, faith is important. Your values and your faith are important. And so I'm assuming that, but even if not, well, truth is important, and science is important, and if you care about science or faith, this is an important conversation for you, because a lot of the questions about science, or even, national questions, do we want to fund science? What's the status of science? These are questions that scientists are very concerned about, and most Americans are religious. They begin their lives religiously. So we can ask these questions in different ways. We can start with the question of authority. The view of the Bible today is very different than it was in the 1970s. When Gallup polls started questioning people with questions like, do you think the Bible is the inspired Word of God? A very basic question, right? Not talking about inerrancy per se, but inspired Word of God. People would respond, for the most part, yes. 40% of Americans said yes. And most Americans had a favorable view of the Bible. Today, however, according to the same polling agency, fewer than 1 in 4 Americans, 24%, now believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and 13% of college grads. So you can see those numbers have changed quite a bit since the 1970s. On the other hand, a little bit more than 25%, 26%, view the Bible as a book of fables, legends, myths, moral precepts that were invented with a human agenda. This is a very negative view of the Bible for over a quarter of folks, and then a very much less of a positive view for a quarter. And the 50% is somewhere in the middle. And you can look at this data, but the point is, the Bible, religion is losing authority. We can look at statistics in my paper that's coming out of this conference. So look at statistics on how well are religious ministers trusted, religious authorities. How much do people trust them, as opposed to how much do they trust scientists? We find another survey done by the American Bible Society has numbers a little lower. They have 1 in 5 Americans see the Bible as the Word of God, same question. And only 13% of those under age 30. So the point of this is, if you're working with youth, in general, you will find that many youth, as a starting point, and their peers, do not have much faith in religious authorities, in Scripture. If you're a Christian, same sort of data if you're in other religions as well. But Christians tend to hold the Bible at a different level than in other religious contexts. So we're going to talk about Christians. On the other hand, if we look at cultural authority, we find that science is doing well. Scientists are seen as trustworthy. Science is seen as authoritative. Americans show a strong deference to the views of the scientific community and have a great deal of confidence in its leaders. And scientists are the only group of 13 groups that have been polled, institutions that have been covered in the general social survey conducted by the National Opinion Research Center. Science is the only one where public confidence has remained strong since the 1970s. Religion has dipped, science has remained stable, or science has grown, depending on the questions you ask. And so you can say in science we trust, like this Photoshop coin, and people see folks like Bill Nye saving the world. Right? And so even using savior language, we find there's a shift in authority. At the same time, we can look at data of what's going on with youth when they go to college. Depending on which research you look at, some will say 60% of youth, when they go to college, abandon their faith for good. Others would say 90% abandon their faith, and some of them come back. Right? So depending on how you want to phrase the question, it's a huge percentage. Others look at youth who don't go to college and find 70 to 75% of these youth, once they leave high school, leave the church. And these are folks who aren't going to college. And we can say, okay, well, what sort of reasons do youth give? There's a lot of data on this, more data than you might even imagine. There's lots and lots of data, many studies. My paper, I think, I cite something like 12 different studies that are showing the same numbers by different organizations, but we can also ask what sort of reasons do they give. And one of the main groups doing these studies, which is the Barna Group, and this is a book by David Kinnaman, who's part of the Barna Group, a book called You Lost Me, which is a good book if you want to look at the data in this. He says, issues of science are one of the significant points of disconnection between the next generation and Christianity. And interesting, David Kinnaman, he's not a scientist. He's not really even particularly interested in science. He's interested in data as it relates to the church. And it was a bit of a surprise to him to find, when he did this research, and his organization did this research, that when you look at this group of youth, this is in 2011, they published this. When you look at the study, it's focusing on young adults who were regular Christian churchgoers during their teenage years. They were engaged in the church, but they started becoming disconnected around the age of 15, and then had left by the time they were in high school. And they found that 59% of young Christians disengage either permanently or for an extended period of time from church life around this age. So he was wondering, okay, well, what are some of the reasons? What are the reasons that these 3 out of 5 young Christians give for disconnecting after the age of 15? So they asked lots of interviews. They had some trends that they found, though there was no one particular reason. They found 6 significant reasons that everyone gave, and they had to do with things like, well, the church doesn't really deal well with doubt when you're skeptical, or the church is too protective in certain ways. But the number one reason they gave, and this was a surprise for Kinnaman and others, was science. Right? And so we could say, okay, youth left the church because of reasons of science. Well, what sort of reasons? What would they say? Some things they would say is the church is too confident in terms of knowing all the answers when science and faith are interacting. And most of these youth see this in terms of a war that has always been going on. We'll talk about that in a moment. The churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. Christianity is anti-science, and they're turned off by the whole creation versus evolution debate. So you can look at some of the percentages there, and these are the highest numbers of this 59%. And the number one reason, if you look at the percentages, interesting when they put this on their website, they don't give the reasons in terms of percentages, but these are the highest percentages, so this is actually the number one reason, and it's science. So just for that, we can say if you're interested in youth and youth ministry, then science should be something you're interested in. On the other side of the youth, when I'm teaching at USF, and I give them the first question, the second question actually, their first homework assignment, which is this: do you believe that God could exist, and do you think your belief is reasonable? So USF is a Catholic institution, officially a Jesuit institution, though many of the students there are very mixed. Typically, in a class of 40, we'll have a good half of those students will be agnostic or atheist, and then the rest of different mixed religious traditions. And when you start looking at the questions, I just took a random sample of questions. I'm just going to do a random sample, and put them up there from 40 students and see what happens. So one student says, and I ordered them, so there's an order, but what I find interesting is how they answer this question. One student says, I do believe that God exists, and my belief is rational. I believe that is our existence, and the creation is because of God. The universe is so complex that it cannot simply be made by chance. There must be some sort of higher power that had a plan for the order of the universe. Notice what the student cites as a justification for their belief that they kept in college, right? So this is a sophomore, and they're citing complexity, they're citing chance, they're talking about the universe, right? You don't find, I believe that God exists because of my personal relationship with Jesus. What's interesting is that's a very, very minor answer, right? In terms of, like, do you believe God could exist? You do find that, or someone has experienced a miracle in their life. But it's interesting when you ask this question. Some people will say, my belief isn't reasonable because I have faith, right? But that's a 1 out of 40 answer, that sort of answer. And so the ones that I randomly chose have these themes. Again, it's a random sample. I went through and looked at the others, and this is actually pretty typical. So, statistically, it's typical in choosing these. I also found that when I looked through the various answers, I thought, well, this is strange. I must have I didn't cherry pick them, but I'm thinking this must be an atypical sample because they're all mentioning these similar themes. But I looked through them again, and I thought, no, this is pretty typical. In my opinion, it is hard to believe that God does not exist if we approach this question logically and according to science. We come down to the atoms and the basis of materials. Then the question should be asked, who created atoms and the initial particles that created the world? All these lead me to think there is a God who is behind all these phenomena. Again, a believer in God who references science. Another person who believes in God says, I do believe that there could, in fact, be a God. I think my belief is rational, could be plausible. My belief is that there is a God. If there is a God, then he is the greatest scientist ever. Very explicit reference to science. Many people think that God and science are separate and opposite things, like miracles versus logical or coincidental occurrences. Even though I grew up Christian, my belief is not that God is concerned with us as humans or that there's an afterlife. So more of a deistic perspective of God, left the idea of a personal God. He created the world and the universe in his lab, and consequently all the physics around us, including us as well. What science is doing is gaining some of the knowledge that he already knows. Us being here are just consequences of randomness, and he is not concerned with us. So we see a slight trend, right? We have the randomness. Well, it can't all be random. There has to be a plan. Then other students will say, no, we are part of randomness, but there is some sort of creation. All these are referencing science. We could go to the other side of the spectrum, and I actually cut out 5 agnostics from this group. I chose, I wanted to find a couple theists, so it wasn't a completely random group, because the first 5 I chose were agnostics. And I thought, well, I know I have some theists in there somewhere, so I can look for them. So it wasn't completely chance. But here's an agnostic writing. Currently, I see no visible or immediately believable proof of any God, and there are scientific explanations for many of the things attributed to an almighty power. I was raised in a Christian household, but being more of a rational person, I could not accept the explanations they offered me. I believe it is possible that there could be proof of a God outside of the scope of what humans see. However, I think it was more likely created as a safety net to explain the unknown. I get science as the justification for loss of belief. Another student, I grew up Christian, but now I'm a different agnostic. I have my doubts, but at this stage in life, I don't care if God exists or not. Perhaps this will change for me down the road. I tend to side with what I see as overwhelming tangible evidence favoring evolution. The idea of creation museums in the Bible thumping states is strange and slightly creepy to me. I do think that theism lacks rational support because it has no empirical backing. Again, we can see science as justification, the loss of belief, and one more student that I have here. I believe that there could be a God in the same way. I believe it was actually Santa Claus putting those presents under the tree. In other words, I feel the likelihood of God's existence is so extremely low it's not even worth seriously considering, let alone worshiping. One of the many problems with God for me is that it requires the belief that there is some realm outside of space-time, so it is a much more difficult possibility to swallow compared to something like aliens, which exist in the realm of space and time. Again, as science justification, the student goes on to talk about other things as well, like the warfare between religion and science, as the church always being anti-science. This is another student who grew up in a religious context with abandoned faith because of science. And there are so many examples of this, right? I could show you slide after slide after slide, but I think you get the point with these students. So we can say, well, what do we do with this? It's clear, as the Barna Group says, as David Kinnaman says in this book, You Lost Me, that science has come to dominate and define our collective culture. This is someone who does research on church trends, who's not, again, particularly interested in science, but they go where the data is, and they don't think this is a good thing, right? People leaving the church because they want people to stay in church. So they want to give advice on how to keep people in churches. And the advice they give is not like this. If you can see this, right? This is young people, how to stop them from leaving the church. The first one says get them involved and have them cleaning toilets. Second one says let them lead the service. And there they are on skateboards. Encourage the congregation to be more youth-friendly. And just looks like a youth in a backwards hat. And then this is my favorite one. Adjust the service time. Morning service, no longer 9 a.m., but 11:30 a.m. or a bit later if you prefer. Send them on a life-changing trip and it's raining at the beach. Or just lock the doors. Right. And so behind every joke is a bit of seriousness. And this is an expression of churches struggling to answer this question. What do you do? How do you keep youth in the church? Well, again, look at the data. If we look at the same book, You Lost Me, the Barna research shows that for youth still in the church, many science-minded youth, which are most of the youth, are struggling to find ways of staying faithful to their beliefs and to their professional calling in science-related industries. Most youth in the churches today are interested in science-oriented jobs. And they're trying to figure out, they don't want to leave their faith. They completely want to keep their faith. But they can't figure out how to do this. And these approaches aren't going to help. And there's all kinds of other approaches that aren't going to help. If we want to look at the generation that's currently in the church, the Barna Group just released a study on Generation Z, as they call it, and they find that more than one-third of engaged Christian teens, 37%, and more than half of church-going teens say that the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world, and they see that as a problem. And if we look at data on churches, we find, compared to the average American, especially under 30, 73% of Americans under 30 accept evolution as it relates to human beings. But if we look at this up here, we find that over 70% of Protestant pastors, so this is a national poll of Protestant pastors, do not believe that God used evolution. It's not saying evolution by itself created humans. It's saying that God used evolution to create humans. They strongly disagree. And if you look at the numbers closer, we find that only 4% of Protestant pastors with congregations over 250 accept evolution. 96% say no of megachurch pastors, you'd say. If you want to call over 250 a megachurch. But they're interested. So the biggest churches reject evolution, but most American youth accept it. And whether or not you think evolution is true or not, this is something you have to consider and think about if you're involved in youth ministry. I feel bad doing this, but I found this book because she actually cites the Barna data. So I thought, wow, a youth minister who actually is citing the data on this about science. And she opens up her chapters with quotes from You Lost Me. Saying, youth are leaving because of science. And I thought, there's such potential here. But unfortunately, I wouldn't recommend this book because where she goes is she rejects evolution. She ends up rejecting science. She ends up doing the exact things that the Barna researchers say you shouldn't do. And so there's so many books out there like this. Most of them don't mention science at all. But the ones I find that do mention science are doing more of the same. Right? They're increasing this trend rather than addressing it. And so we can say, okay, well, what about youth ministers? Are youth, these are books about ministries. We can find that churches that were surveyed by, again, the same research group, looks at youth group teens who aspire to science-related careers. They find that over half the youth in churches that are engaged are interested in scientific careers, but less than 1% of youth groups had talked about science in any capacity within the previous year of the study. Right? And so there's no way, youth groups are not interested in addressing these questions. I think a lot of youth leaders have no clue what to do with these questions. What do you do with youth in a science context? Some of them tend to ignore the whole issue, but ignoring it doesn't help people keep their faith. And only 1% of the youth pastors surveyed in the survey addressed anything related to science in the previous year. And so we have a crisis on our hands. This crisis has roots. Another huge survey, which was done from 2001 to 2015 at the University of Notre Dame, were the folks who led it, and it's called the National Study of Youth and Religion, or National Survey on Youth and Religion. A number of publications came out of that. Christian Smith was the Notre Dame sociologist who was leading that study. And Smith says, well, American middle schoolers preoccupied with smartphones, text messaging, and internet memes lose their religious faith owing to, and it's interesting what he says they lose their faith owing to, the influence of lingering cultural residues of intellectual doctrines that exhilarated science and philosophy in the 1880s and 1930s. And he continues on in this section, and there's actually a whole section with the title Positivism, Logical Positivism. He says, ironically, at the same time that American teenagers are confronting the consequences of major contemporary technological revolutions in communication technologies, many of them also continue to assume popular but antiquated cultural mentalities about science and knowledge rooted in 19th and early 20th century thought, logical positivism, and naive empiricism. Right? And so you can read this, and the youth director at the church that I work with, Rochelle, can I share the story when I gave you this quote? And Rochelle says, what's logical positivism and naive empiricism? Right? And that is part of the point, is this is an academic text. I'm sure there's folks among you that don't even know what this paragraph is about. And you might be academics. And so this is very specific. This is a great book, but you can't expect your typical, or even your above average youth director in a church to pick this up, say, oh yes, of course, logical positivism. That's oh yes, I have a quick solution for that. So the point is, the reason I'm doing this topic is because it needs translation. Right? And I'm hoping that folks out there that will watch these videos from today and from the conference will get something out of that, or at least read the paper that comes out of it, because I want to start a translation project so we can say, okay, what's at the root of this? What is logical positivism? What's naive empiricism? These authors tell us it's defunct, but why? And how can we make that understandable? We can start by looking at Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, right? Everyone knows the Lord of the Rings. And so we can use an analogy like this. And I can think, okay, well, there's two towers. This is actually deeper than one might think, because Tolkien and Lewis are working on these texts, and Lewis is talking about science versus scientism versus subjectivism. And the two towers, you have one tower which is focused on technology and creating new genetic experiments and works. And then you have the other is a big eye, just looking around. And there's something, and Lewis talks about scientism, the worship of science, and subjectivism, the worship of self. And Tolkien gives us this in the two towers. And so these are actually in the text, which is kind of fun. If you read Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, you have the same things going on, science and the subjective aspect. And today we can talk about these as postmodernism and positivism. Postmodernism has a tendency towards subjectivism. Positivism is scientism. What's scientism? Scientism is what we might call science deified, when you make science into a god. And this means that belief in science will solve all our problems, answer all our questions, and the human subject is insignificant. Everything in science is absolutely objective, value-free, and you don't even need human moral responsibility. Science can determine its own values. Science doesn't need our values. Science will give us values. This is scientism. We find some people writing in today's scene. I'm going to single out the guy named, he calls himself Science Mike. That's his celebrity name. His actual name is Mike McHargue. He's written a book. Again, I'm not recommending this book. I want to be clear on that, because I see Science Mike as deifying science in the sense that science gets the ultimate answer for everything. And I think that's not a good way to go. The other way to go is the way of postmodern youth ministry, which I'm going to put at the other tower. And we could call postmodern, focus on postmodernism without limits, subjectivism. And Lewis called this science defied. Right? So science deified and science defied. Right? So that's an easy way to think about these. One is science has no value at all. The other is science is absolute. And how do you navigate between these two towers? How do you find some sort of medium? And what's interesting is the same authors who are writing this book, Soul Searching, on the National Youth Survey in Religion, says that they don't think postmodernism is the way to go. And churches should try to do some radically new postmodern youth ministry. And that books that talk about teenage years and religion that depict youth as uniquely postmodern, they say are fundamentally wrong. They say youth are much more on the positivistic end, the scientific end, than the postmodern end. The youth they surveyed at least. And so they would say, don't spend time doing books like Postmodern Youth Ministry, or Rob Bell has gotten into the postmodern way of approaching things. If you know Rob Bell, he has a show, Oprah hosts a show of his, right? So he's very well known. There's the scientism. Science Mike's book is not that very different from a perspective of someone like Jerry Coyne, if you ask me, who's very anti-religious, because science always has the answer. And when you look at well, what does theology have to contribute to this conversation? It's essentially nothing. It's all at the level of mystical, personal feelings, right? And so he goes postmodern with theology, positivist with the science. So again, these are all books I'm not recommending. What's the problem with scientism? Well, if you're from within the context of faith, and you believe Scripture is anything important to say, scientism undervalues Scripture. What's the problem with postmodernism? Well, it undervalues both science and Scripture. To say science is nothing but art, right? And Science Mike actually says, well, the Bible is nothing but art. It has the same authority as any piece of ancient literature, be it Enuma Elish, you name it, right? And so I say, well, maybe your church is comfortable with that perspective on the Bible, but if not, you say, well, even if you're not, is that going to give youth a reason to stay? We're telling them there is no point in you staying in this church. You should just make that a sermon, right? And send them on their way. Rather than trying to tell them, well, the Scripture actually has nothing interesting or of value to say to you, and the science has something of value. Why are you in the church? That's the question youth ask, and then they leave. Postmodern subjectivism does that with both science and Scripture, and the youth leave. So these are not pragmatic ways to keep youth in faith, but we can also ask a deeper question of truth. That's another question we can ask. So I want to try to find an approach that takes science seriously without going into scientism, and takes theology and Scripture seriously without falling into some sort of, what I would say, unbiblical creationism, some sort of young earth creationism, or any sort of creationism that sets itself over and against the natural world, which I would say is unbiblical, because if you look at when Romans talk, the book of Romans in the New Testament says God can be understood, God's very nature, visible nature can be understood by what God has created. Well, that's a warrant for doing science when I read that. So we can say, okay, another thing, this is the start. Avoid New York Times bestsellers at all costs. All these books, New York Times bestseller, New York Times bestseller. Thinking, wow, there's a lot of really bad New York Times bestsellers. So rule of thumb, if you go with anything, don't read New York Times bestsellers if you want to have any substantial engagement with any topic. And so, but what do we want to go beyond that? Well, I'm going to give 9 practical steps to how to do this. I'm actually give advice which is something academics don't do, but this is what everyone's looking for. What do I do? What's something practical? So I would say, from working with both undergraduates and youth, I'd say where you start is by listening and learning where your particular youth are at. If you work with youth, if you're in a congregation, even if you're teaching students, learn where they're at if this is an issue you want to think about. Learn where they're at. Listening and learning takes humility. And this is a hermeneutical circle. So it ends with humility, and humility leads you back into listening and learning, and you start over again. Exposing false dichotomies. Lots of false dichotomies are out there. Things like God versus science. Cover of Time magazine from a few years ago. And we take a look at this, we're like, okay, what's the voice of God? Francis Collins. What's the voice of science? Richard Dawkins. Wait, I'm confused. Didn't Francis Collins lead the Human Genome Project and accomplish it successfully? What did Richard Dawkins do with science? Oh yeah, he wrote The Selfish Gene. He's a but aren't these both scientists? Why is Francis Collins God, and why is Richard Dawkins science? Even if you think about that for 3 minutes, you should already start to ask whether this is a true dichotomy. Because you have one unbelieving scientist and one believing scientist. So it's not God versus science. It's one scientist versus another scientist, and how does their faith come into it? And so just thinking about these, or creation versus evolution. God can't create through evolution. Why are we setting up this dichotomy in the first place? Right? We're already answering the question before we've asked it. And that's the problem with false dichotomies. Step 3, view doubt as a doorway to deeper faith. Doubt, if you look at Thomas uniquely makes a statement about the divinity of Jesus from starting in doubt. And so doubt is not always something that we should avoid and discourage, especially lots of these students in this data, these youth who are no longer in church will say, yeah, church is more uncomfortable with my doubt. I can ask my questions. And so this is step 3, see doubt as an opportunity for conversation, to go deeper. 4, instructing youth on how to think well, how to think critically, rather than simply what to think. There's a lot of these books out there telling them exactly what to think. There's not a focus in critical thinking, how to ask questions, how to get to a deeper question behind the question. And these are skills that we should foster when we work with youth. Think about, well, how do you really ask the question that you're asking, rather than simply giving information that's cookie-cutter information in response to a particular question. 5, teaching some history of science as it relates to faith. I'll talk a little bit about this. This might be a tougher one for people to do in the context of youth ministry, but it's important, and you'll see why in a moment. 6, introducing some philosophy of science. This is also a tricky one, but we'll talk about this in a minute, because this has to do with what science is and what it is not. 7, challenging widespread myths about the history and nature of science. We're going to talk about this one. I'll give you some examples. And 8, using creative mutual interaction as the method of choice. Creative mutual interaction is a phrase of Bob Russell's, and it's saying that both theology and science have something of value to say when they're talking to each other. And so this is the approach that really gets people thinking and really leads to what these researchers call cognitive resilience, which is a critical thinking mechanism that allows you to ask questions, to go deeper, to have a foundation when they ask these questions. And so I'm going to talk about, if you're going to the conference, I'm going to talk about these in a lot of depth at the conference on Saturday. I'm only going to talk about a couple of them tonight because we have a little bit less time. But step 9, seeking always to stay honest and humble. And this gets you back to listening, right? The question of listening, right? Humility, honesty, intellectual humility, intellectual honesty. Always realizing that we're all in a place of learning as the specialists. And these steps, if you want to remember them, just have to spell the word Leviticus, which didn't take too much from anybody. But as I started to do them, I thought, well, I already have half of Leviticus. I can make this work. So CMI, which is actually you originally had in a different order. CMI was the C of Leviticus. But anyway, the point here is, I think this is a good way to think about it, because it's how are you if you're talking about ministry, right, Leviticus is the law of the priest, is what it means. And so, ministry, well, what's a good law for ministry when you're interacting with youth, especially with this question of science? And so we can talk about these. Step 7, I'm going to talk about step 7 a bit here. Challenging myths. There's lots of myths. Every semester when I teach youth, when I teach undergrads at USF, we talk about things like, have you ever heard the idea that Christopher Columbus proved the world was round, and everyone believed the world was flat at that time? Everyone's like, yeah, I was talking in elementary school. And then I have them read articles, I show them a couple videos, and we talk about this as an absolute myth that was invented by some folks in the Victorian age and happened to work its way into the Encyclopedia Britannica. And then it's interesting because I start to watch these students assess me as a crazy person who's giving them articles and think, okay, this is some alternative reality this guy's trying to initiate us into. What's going on here? But they read and they keep reading, and some of them will eventually start to say, oh yeah, I believe this actually was a myth because you're telling them a different story. And then there's cognitive dissonance that's replaced with an open mind. And this is the point of talking about the myths, is these myths are so prevalent, right? This is something that is believed by these are things that are believed by over 90% of people surveyed, right? Everyone believes that science and religion is at war or always has been at war. It's extremely rare to find folks under 30 who do not believe this. And so if they're believing this, they're going to say, okay, well, I'm expecting there to be a war. So to talk about this, the idea that science and Christian faith especially have always been at war was an idea that was invented by Victorian humanists. The three main ones are Thomas Henry Huxley, who coined the term agnostic. He's sometimes known. He tried to present Darwin's theory in an atheistic light. That was one of his things. Whereas other folks in America talked about Darwin's theory in a theistic light. But Huxley was very impactful. He started a club called the X Club, hence the X, that promoted this idea. John Draper, A.D. White, we'll learn about them in a moment in the video. They really didn't like the influence of the Christian religion on science or on culture. Peter Harrison, who's a historian of science, used to be at Oxford, I think, or Cambridge. I think he's in Australia now. Says the enduring legacy of this group, Huxley's X Club and Draper and White, has been the perpetuation of the myth of the perennial warfare between science and religion. So rather than trying to convince you with articles, I'm going to have a couple of historians of science talk about this. I'm going to show you a video that I played a part in helping to produce. So these are good people, and let's see if this works. Okay.
Between men ever, and we're going to solve it tonight. There are a lot of people out there who say you can't mix science and religion, they can't coexist.
How do good scientists really believe in God?
Do any scientists believe in God?
Against publicity. This battle, is it science versus God?
So then is science compatible with religion?
The origin of the conflict or warfare thesis for science and religion, we have to go to the late 19th century, particularly to two men. John William Draper, an English immigrant to the United States in the 1830s, first president of the American Chemical Society, and an amateur historian. And Andrew Dickson White, a senator in the New York legislature and first president of Cornell University. Each of them wrote a book on the conflict, in the case of Draper, or the warfare of science and religion, in the case of White. They gave this historical view that science and religion have always been at odds. The impetus behind both of these is not particularly historical. It's rooted in political and social events of the time. The real reason that White was writing is he says that he was reacting against sectarian, that is, denominational Christian attacks on the founding of Cornell University as a non-sectarian institution. The problem is that these attacks are actually rather difficult to identify what exactly they were. And if we scratch the surface, what we see is, in fact, political maneuvering and fighting over federal dollars.
He tells Cornell at the time that he's going to give his opponents a lesson which they will remember. So he goes on a crusade to paint the existing scholars and attitudes of the old liberal arts colleges and denominational colleges as backward, and his own ideas as progressive. Draper has a somewhat different agenda. He does use the word conflict in the title of his book, but he's not focused on refuting traditional Christian theology. He simply wants to indict the Catholic Church for abuses of power.
The problem with the books is that they're terrible history. The historical facts, that's very generous to call them facts, are cherry-picked or contorted, taken out of context in order to promote the author's main ideas about this perpetual warfare between science and religion. The word scientist is only created in the 1830s. Draper and White are part of this professionalization of the sciences. And so they're carving out a niche, a social niche, a political niche for the scientist, the person who does the sciences. A fundamental piece to understand is that we cannot look at the past as if it were divided into the scientists and the religionists. For most of history, those people were one and the same. There were not two camps.
In the 17th century, in the 16th century, that's the period of time that historians usually call the scientific revolution. Nearly all of the major scientists were Christians, quite a few of them very devout. An example here would be the life and work of Robert Boyle. Boyle was a major figure in what we call today chemistry. He was one of the founders of the modern scientific method and enterprise. Boyle calls the world itself a temple, and he sees himself as a priest in that temple.
He liked to do chemical experiments, particularly on Sundays, because he felt they were a kind of devotion. He argued that being devoted to the study of nature made one a better Christian, not a worse one. But there are lots of other cases. Nicholas Steno, who enunciated the fundamental laws of geology about strata, who was a convert to Catholicism, became a priest and then a bishop.
Johannes Kepler, he sees science as a religious activity.
His idea was that by discovering the mathematical relationships between the times of a planet's orbit around the sun, he was revealing the eternal mathematical principles by which God made creation. The Catholic Church was probably the greatest patron of the arts and sciences that the world has ever known. Jesuits in particular were foundational in optics, magnetism, seismology. Likewise, we can go to medicine, where hospitals and medical work was the province of the church. So a lot of medical innovation and investigation was done in religious centers for most of the last 2,000 years.
The idea that science and religion have been always involved in this inevitable conflict is not true.
Yet, the legacy of these two books, of these two men, are foundational. Journalists tend to take the Draper and White theses of conflict or warfare between science and religion as the fundamental starting point for everything else. So even 150 years after these books were published, and after a time when people no longer actually read them, they have given the stage direction, so to speak, for scientists and religionists to attack each other. The kind of struggles are not really with each other, but with the difficulty of understanding. And once we realize that, I think we'll have a much more positive alliance rather than warfare between the two, without the detriment to either but the benefit to both.
So when you think about this, and when you think about these questions that are being raised, and what's interesting is Principe, who was the last person to speak there, talks about how they had phenomenal marketers. Right? These books were the result of, they were translated into dozens of languages and had phenomenal marketing. And what you have is a situation where their marketing is so effective that even in the books that are talking about the data we're talking about, again, here's another David Kinnaman Barna Group book, and they start their discussion on science. Before they even talk about the data, this is the opening sentence. Christianity and science have been at loggerheads for centuries. No citation. Where do they get that? Well, they don't need a citation. They don't need to talk about it because it's assumed by the culture. The specific scientific discoveries and theories at issue these days may be new, but the tension between the two systems of explained life is not. They just assume that. So even before you begin the discussion, you're already starting from behind. Right? That's why the myth is so important to expose, right? A simple video gets you started, but we can go in more depth. We'll go in a little bit more depth here. Another example of this myth, one of the biggest blunders of the age of Christendom was the Church's reaction to the Copernican revolution. Nicholas Copernicus and the scientists who followed after him, such as Galileo, stood on the crest of a wave of science that eventually brought Christendom to its knees. And so you have the rhetoric, you have specific examples, Copernicus and Galileo. This is in the book Postmodern Youth Ministry. Tony Jones just received a major grant to talk about youth ministry. And he talks a little bit about science, but approaches it from a postmodern perspective. But gets it so fundamentally wrong. We find this everywhere. Dan Brown has a whole book on this, where he talks about outspoken scientists like Copernicus were murdered by the church for revealing scientific truths. And maybe you know Copernicus wasn't murdered. But more serious books like The Atheist Universe, which Richard Dawkins says an admirable work. This was actually the best-selling book in atheism before Dawkins' God Delusion was published. But he says the church fought bitterly throughout its history, is still fighting today to impede scientific progress. Galileo, remember, was nearly put to death by the church for constructing this telescope and discovering the moons of Jupiter. So we look at these examples. Here's two specific examples. Copernicus is murdered. Galileo almost put to death for discovering the moons of Jupiter. In my book, I talk about both these cases. This is my Science and Religion book. What was going on? Was there a Copernican revolution? Was Copernicus a revolutionary? If you look back, you find this was actually this question of whether the Earth moves was a question that preceded Copernicus by centuries. John Buridan is talking about this, who's professor at the University of Paris. Bishop Nicola Rismany is talking about whether physics alone can demonstrate whether the Earth is rotating. Both of them entertain the possibility that the Earth is moving, but they can't think of a good physical experiment that can prove it. They talk about if you shoot an arrow up in a boat, the arrow comes down. And how do you know if the boat is moving or not? There's a conservation of angular momentum, which goes all the way back to Basil of Caesarea, that idea. And Galileo talks about that. Galileo's proof was the theory of the tides. The tides is what proves that the Earth is moving. His theory was actually wrong. The concept was right. But this is an idea that goes back well before Copernicus. Nicholas of Cusa is already arguing for the possible motion of Earth. The point is, at the time of Copernicus, there was no reason to believe that this would cause a religious controversy. And you can see there's cardinals and bishops in this discussion. None of these were heretics. Copernicus, when he published as a result of being prodded by many high-ranking church officials. So if you're thinking, okay, well, what's the role of the church? Were they hounding Copernicus? Were they trying to kill him? Did they murder him? No, you find lots of evidence of people encouraging him. Leo X invited him to help reform the calendar. According to the solar year, Copernicus said, I'm too busy. Clement VII invited him He was greatly impressed at what he knew of Copernicus, invited him to come and speak. The Vatican, Copernicus sent an assistant, Johann Wittgenstein, who was received with medals and given a feast, and dedicates his work to Pope Paul III. But we also find letters like this from Cardinal Nicholas von Schoenberg: with the utmost earnestness I entreat you, most learned sir, unless I inconvenience you, to communicate this discovery of yours to scholars. So you find a lot of evidence. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Historians of science, Lindbergh and Numbers, say if Copernicus had any genuine fear of publication, it was the reaction of scientists, not clergy. And this was because there are some serious scientific objections, such as why don't we see something called stellar parallax? If the Earth is on this side of its revolution one time a year and over here, if you look at your finger and close one eye and open the other, you'll see your finger moves, and you can measure how far it is from that. Well, Copernicus said the stars were 40 million miles away. For parallax to be shown, they had to be 150 billion miles away for them not to show parallax. And that's just too big of a universe for even Copernicus to consider. And so Copernicus could not resolve these questions. He published anyway, as a result of being encouraged by the church. Myth is completely wrong. Copernicus not murdered. No one's trying to stop him from publishing him. I wouldn't even say Copernicus is a revolutionary, if you look at the data. What about Galileo? Nearly put to death for discovering the moons of Jupiter. At the time of Galileo, when he first started his work, he wasn't a Copernican, but there are two systems out there. The two great systems at the time of Galileo were one by Tycho Brahe, who had a system that was geoheliocentrism, which had two centers of the solar system, interestingly enough, rather than one center of the solar system. We find that Galileo, when he begins his investigations, is interested in Brahe's system, but then becomes a Copernican. But in correspondence with Kepler, Kepler tells Galileo, today there's no one who would doubt what is common to both the Copernican system and the Tychonic hypothesis. We know that the Jesuits actually taught both. Where's Ptolemy in this picture? Well, he's not in the picture. Everyone's either Tycho Brahe or Copernicus, right? Ptolemy is actually a straw man at this time to prove his point. And the Pope is actually the one who recommends, you should title your book Dialogue of the Two Great World Systems, as opposed to On the Tides, because the Pope, at the time of Galileo, was not too convinced his tides argument was correct. He actually cites Kepler as someone who had an alternate hypothesis, was that the moon exerts a force on the water. And Kepler was right, Galileo was wrong. But this is part of the story. So what happened? He discovers the moons of Jupiter. Was he nearly put to death? No, the Jesuits in Rome give him a medal, throw him a couple feasts, and he's celebrated as a hero. Different story. This one has a lot of available documentary evidence. The other one was invented by Andrew Dickson White. Right? And that's why it's important. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But there is hope. The student that wrote on Santa Claus was someone that would come to my office every Wednesday when we talk about this stuff. When he graduated from USF, I wasn't sure whether he was at. He emailed me several years later with more questions and kept talking. And recently, in October 2018, this individual here, Michael Jones, who is who puts together videos, and so one of the videos he put together is called "Are Miracles Even Possible?" And this is someone who does this for a living, right? You can see he has 82,000 subscribers on YouTube, and he has me in this video, which is over 23,000 views. I'm not focused on the video; I'm just a talking head from time to time. And but he's a Facebook friend of mine, and he said that he thought I'd be happy to see this from one of my former students, that he's no longer an atheist. And so this was the guy who's talking about Santa Claus, right? And from all this conversation, from being introduced to these myths, from walking with him through these questions, he's come back to an engaged faith on the other side. So it's not impossible. And that's the good news. With all these people leaving the faith, I want to end on a positive note, that people can come back, but it takes listening, it takes time, it takes discernment, it takes engaging with their questions, not giving cookie-cutter answers, but really going into the deeper questions that really do have, there really are ways to talk about these things that can bring people to a deeper faith in the context of their doubt. And so if you're involved in any sort of ministry, that's what the focus of the conference on Saturday will be. So if you're able, I encourage you to come to that if you're interested in these questions. If not, yes, I hope you still learn something. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. We have time for a few questions. I'll let you.
Okay, yes, questions? Yes, Brady, I think you have a hand first.
Yeah, I'm curious. I didn't hear much about scientific literacy or accuracy.
Yes.
So you talked about cultural authority, and there are people out there on YouTube, let's say, that are proponents of things like a flat Earth.
Yes.
And so how do you make sure that when you're engaging in conversations with youth, that it's not only engaging with the science, but engaging with what we understand to be properly done or properly vetted science?
Yes, and I think that's why that's where it's helpful to have resources that are, and this is the real key question, because it's like the one book I said I wouldn't recommend, right? She is citing Philip Johnson as one of her sources. And if you know Philip Johnson, you say, well, wait, why are you citing the Cal Berkeley lawyer to talk about science? Right? You could say, well, and who's the person writing the book? Well, she did her bachelor's in business administration, right? No scientific background. Bill Nye, the science guy, doesn't have a background in natural sciences. Neither does Science Mike. Right? Neither of them are natural scientists. Science Mike was a computer technician for Apple, right? And neither of them have any professional or academic background in science. And so that doesn't stop people from listening to them. And so I will try to introduce people like, okay, here's a professor of science, of philosophy of science at a major university. Here's George Ellis, who is, he's co-written books with Stephen Hawking, who everyone knows is a legitimate scientist. So I think for me, the more high profile Francis Collins, the more high profile the scientist is, then there's not a question of authority. And I try to avoid people who are on the margins, but that is a tricky issue because where do you even start is often a sort of question. People, how do I know who's a real scientist? Let alone questions of scientific consensus. Well, is there scientific consensus on this or that? And Saturday I'll talk about how scientific facts are always moving too. So the central dogma of molecular biology is no longer the central dogma of molecular biology because of epigenetics, right? So things change, and that's part of the story. Does that answer your question, Braden?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, I don't know who's first, but we'll go Peter and then Stan. Yeah.
Thanks. I'd like to rephrase your question, or paraphrase to tell you, what has the internet to do with truth? and in light of your point number 4, I have 2 sons, both of whose lives have grown up entirely within the orbit of my time at CTNS and in science and religion. And yet they confess to me that they don't read, they don't have time to read, or they don't make time to read. So what they get is on their iPhone.
Yeah.
And sort of picking up on Braden's comment that there's a question relating to your 4th point. How do you determine truth? Now at Berkeley High, both of them had an excellent entire year course in junior year on epistemology.
Yeah.
And yet these poor kids, I sort of feel sorry for them that I have a hard time with a PhD keeping up with everything I read that comes out on Facebook from science, philosophy, religion. How is a 20-year-old expected to do this?
Yes.
And I'm not saying you're going to have the answer.
They can't, and I think that's the point. Is where do you start? Mm-hmm. And I think my answer is it starts with us. We are the academics here. Mm-hmm. Right? Like here we are. What are we doing for public service? How are we trying to take our knowledge that we have and filter it in a way that can address these problems? Because the internet is where everyone goes. Mm-hmm. And the video I showed you is it's even in this form, it's not available on the internet. It was gutted for AAAS's website, right? Well, we don't want to offend our atheist subscribers, so they took out the stuff on. They took out half the video because of that. So this is a black market video because I happen to have it on my laptop because I worked on it, right? And so I could show you this, but you're not even going to find that out there. And this is a multi-million-dollar grant initiative to create these videos, but then they don't even see the light of day because the organizations that are partnering are they don't want to upset people. And we're talking AAAS, the producer of Science Magazine, as we don't want to put this out there, right? So this is a deep question. We're in a crisis of truth because even stuff that's really high quality that's produced doesn't even see the light of day, and this is the real question that my answer is, well, you have to start somewhere. So here we are. There's not a lot of us, but anything we can do is better than nothing, which is maybe not a lot of hope for the question. But I think trying to produce and making a priority to produce accessible materials as much as you can. And that's what That's what I'm trying to do. We're working in the trenches with youth to try to do what I can to say, okay, well, what are the questions, or with undergraduates, or whatever context you have, your own kids. I mean, you've dealt with these questions with your own kids, and whether or not you're convincing to them, you could be the judge, right, of how they turned out. But there's a lot of pressure out there to go in different directions. Yeah.
Stan had a question.
Yeah, Stan. Yeah.
Well, my question is, so what do we do? And maybe that'll be on Saturday.
Yeah.
So I think I started coming here maybe 15 years ago.
Sure. Yeah.
20. And there was one person that was here almost always at meetings by the name of Charlie Towns.
Yeah.
And he or Bill Newsom, or you mentioned Francis Collins.
Yeah.
Francis Collins is far away. But there are local scientists, and I'm thinking of Charlie. How many people know who Charlie Towns is? Okay, not everybody. He was a professor here at Berkeley, right across the street, got a Nobel Prize. In fact, I'm already forgetting, but he... What was it again?
1964, discovery of the laser.
Oh yeah, laser. He invented the laser, the maser. It was a maser at first, but so this is, and it was very. He believed in God, and we don't know what to do with making use of these people.
Yeah,
these are scientists, and there's lots of scientists.
Yeah, Bill Newsom's in one of our videos.
Oh really?
Yeah,
he's an old friend of mine.
So so he's we have him as a talking head, and with
But what do we? That is the
Yeah,
question. We're not making use of
Yeah,
the fact that this is possible to be
Yeah.
a great scientist and to believe in
and
God.
that's the reason I chose him as someone for as being the academic advisor for this project was he's a top-notch scientist, and he's a person of faith, and he has a lot of good things to say.
He's got a trouble. There's one problem. We're in Berkeley. He's at Stanford. So.
Well, I know. Yeah, Berkeley wasn't one of the grantees, right? So yeah, I know, right? But I think it's how to make them more visible in the mix of it, and I think that's how to say that there are people who really have both in their life in a very meaningful way, and trying our best to use them as examples.
Maybe we should have a little meeting once a month. People interested in this topic to come up with strategies. I mean, we need a strategy.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of it, right? This is part of it. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
So I really enjoyed the student testimonials at the beginning of your presentation. And I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more about what you're seeing in your position as an undergraduate professor as like the general disposition of the students. I was getting the impression that in the testimonials, a lot of them are, they're defensive, but are you also seeing like a wide range of dispositions? Are they hopeful, or what is the mood like? And the context for the question is there's the time difference between being a youth and an undergraduate is not big, especially if you're conventionally coming out of high school and going right to college.
16 to 17.
Right. But the worlds are very different. There are very different nuances. And so I was like, I just want to get more of your perspective about what the student experience is, what their attitude is like.
Yeah, I would say, if I were to generalize it, very hopeful about their own personal futures, very pessimistic about global future. So politics, there's no authority in that. There's nothing there's nothing to be gained from the progress of society. So extremely skeptical, I would say. But my career, my prospects, my life is going to be good. So there's certainly that divide. Very suspicious of most authorities while gravitating towards the sciences. And so the question of, well, does religion have anything worthwhile to say? And this is, in the philosophy of religion class, the question is, well, what's the point of religion? Some people take the philosophy of religion class, because they can't understand why anyone would ever be religious. And then what's interesting is when that connects with their interest in science, then something starts to click, and they start to see something deeper. But yeah, I think does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Generally, yeah, sure. Yes. Go ahead.
I have a question particularly about how Christians who have a more, shall we say, traditional perspective on science, particularly evolution, have you had the experience of, let's say, established members of a church community being really uncomfortable with teaching ideas like evolution in a church context?
Yes.
And also, how do you prepare your youth as you teach them about science? How do you prepare them to engage with church leaders who might be less scientifically literate than you are training these in?
Yes. Good questions. I think for the first question, I think my approach is to be more literal than the literalist. So I'm trying to think of when that was. When was the Genesis class, Rochelle? So maybe a year and a half ago or something. So we taught a class a year and a half ago, and it was on Genesis. Right? Okay, we're going to talk about creation, and we looked at there on the PowerPoint is Hebrew, bunch of Hebrew, and I'd ask a youth, okay, Will, tell me what that says. I can't read Hebrew. Oh, but that's the language the Bible's written in. What do you mean you can't read the Bible? And then that starts a conversation on the question of, well, what do these texts say? What's the range of meaning, right? If you look at the great sea creatures, the primeval sea creatures, the ancients, the way that you were very large, primeval, ancient, even if you just look at range of meaning, you realize there are textual traditions that are handed down to us through things like the more complex versions, the Septuagint, or different textual traditions. But you go, even looking at the words of this text opens up a whole new realm, which that in itself does a lot of work to reestablish the mystery of these ancient documents, and that we don't have the control over them that we think we do. Because I think young earth creationism is a problem of not taking the text seriously enough. So with Scripture, I would say, we're going to actually take this more seriously. And then other religious leaders, as they go to college, I think that prepares them. Because no matter how much biblical authority anyone has that they encounter, they're going to see that unless they're talking about the Hebrew and the Greek, they're actually not taking it as seriously as the church they're coming from, right? And giving it a different sort of integrity. So that would be sort of one of the, sort of something that I use to a teaching context, open up that question when we're looking at Scripture is the original languages are are really important. And the fact that we don't actually know, like, there's Boan Ergis is a Greek word. We have no clue what it means. We translate it sons of thunder. We don't actually know. It's the only textual reference ever in the ancient world of that Greek term. So why don't we just give it this meaning? But there's a lot of things like that, and we don't even know. Scholarship gives us resources and answers to some of these questions. The fact that there's so much we don't even know about this text, and there's so much we don't know about the natural world, there's a conversation to be had there. So I think humility, again, that's the humility part. Really, really taking a step back from what we think we know and realizing that we don't know as much as we think we know about either science or these documents that we call Scripture.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so, but I think you had a second question that I didn't answer.
How do you help youth engage with their teachers who are less scientifically literate than they themselves might be?
Yes. You mean at school?
I'm actually thinking more like, how do you help students engage with pastors that they might encounter in the future? Who are
I think preparing them as best as we can, but realizing, I mean, they're going to have that as a value when they go away. And that's, for youth, some of our youth currently they're going to college, they're concerned whether they're going to find a church that takes science seriously. So hoping that they find a church that can fit that context, which is rare. I mean, we see 1% here. It's very rare, but they are out there too, especially in college communities. So, but yeah, thank you.
Let's give Josh a before we adjourn, 2 weeks from today, 24th, right here, we'll have another public event, and it's going to be on CRISPR. I really urge you to come and think about it. I want to thank Braden and Melissa for the setup and the evening, especially Joshua, come on Saturday, 1 o'clock for the conference.